Lecture 5, the 28th of May, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, I am still in the process of convalescing, but did not wish, despite that, to cancel the lectures today and Thursday because the semester is dreadfully short as it is, and much has to be cancelled anyway. 1. I would also like to ask for your forbearance as far as the precision of my expression is concerned, and above all for the clarity of my speech, since I have had a throat infection and still find speaking a little difficult. Ladies and gentlemen, let us return to the treatment of the third antinomy, and I should like to try to pick up the thread where we left off in the last lecture. The main idea of this chapter is very plausible, and I would even say relatively simple. If we assume an ultimate, absolute cause, we offend against the postulate implicit in the principle of causality, namely its universal applicability. In other words, if we arbitrarily break the series of causes to be sought, we violate the principle of causality itself. According to this, everything that exists, including any cause one might discover, must itself have a further cause, because something falls within a law-like context of experience, only by virtue of the universality of the causal principle. If that is not the case, if anything is excluded from this universal framework of laws, this represents a failure of the lawful order that Kant has proclaimed to be a quasi-divine or rather human world order, and basically does away with the idea of ordered experience as such. In the same way, you should hold fast to one of the motifs of the critique of pure reason, one that is commonly not emphasized so strongly. What I have in mind is what might be called the fear of chaos, a motif of great importance for the entire grounding of moral philosophy in Kant. 2. So nothing should remain outside, there should be nothing that disrupts the total framework of laws. Conversely, however, if such an ultimate cause is not presupposed, then there is no complete causality, but only what Kant called a relative, in other words a secondary, causality. I expect you will recall the passage. In that event we offend against the rule that nothing may happen without sufficient reason. In a sense, we break off prematurely, by failing to look for such an ultimate cause. In both cases the error is a failure to satisfy the logic of the principle of causality. In the first instance, because the principle claims universal applicability, we are unable to discover an ultimate, absolute cause simply because this would mean suspending the desire for universality itself. The alternative is to decline to assume the existence of such a cause, and act as if there is no such thing as an ultimately accessible cause, but only a secondary cause, so that the concept of causality remains forever unfulfilled. It is important, therefore, and I wish to emphasize it as strongly as I can. You may perhaps regard this as a somewhat formalistic point and be tempted to ignore it, but believe me, I have my reasons for making such a meal of it. What I am concerned about is that you should understand from the outset that the contradiction we are confronted with is not, as Kant would have us believe in the solution, a contradiction that results from our inadequate use of causality, but is, rather, a contradiction that arises because things in the world by their own meaning necessarily become caught up in this contradiction. 3. This is why I have tried to show you the two sides of Kant's argument, so that you can see how on both occasions, that is, by following the logic of the two antinomic theses, or antitheses, you end up violating the meaning of the principle of causality itself. In proceeding like this I have not done violence to Kant in any way, because Kant himself proceeds in exactly the same way as I have just done. That is to say, on both occasions his method makes him confront the meaning inherent in causality itself, and in both cases he shows that you end up violating the meaning of the concept. It is a matter of indifference whether you take your search for causes to the point of infinity, thereby renouncing the search for an ultimate, conclusive cause, or whether you decline to do this and hence break off the search arbitrarily. It is the hypostasis of an absolute cause, or an absolute process of causation, that leads to such contradictions. Now Kant believed, and this is the crucial point, that in reality we are simply confronted here by a mistaken usage, that we are applying the concept of causality beyond the limits of possible experience, and that if we were to moderate our demands, and refrain from making such excessive claims, we would not land up in these antinomies. The habit of thinking Kant displays here is one that later on was to become characteristic of positivism as a whole. Positivists say, well, then, if you have to impose such exaggerated demands on knowledge, you will end up in all sorts of difficulties, so it would be better to settle for less right from the start, and content yourselves with your daily bread. Behave from the outset like bureaucrats who refuse to lift a finger to do any work that is outside their department, and you will never come to any great harm. However, let us assume that what I have told you is correct, and that, as I believe is implicit in the Kantian line of thought, these antinomies actually arise from confronting the application, the possible application, of the category of causality with its meaning. In that event, this would show that the rather comfortable construction that Kant puts on the matter, one which tends to stay within the framework of the existing division of labor in the spirit of dwell in the land and lead an upright life for, that this interpretation contradicts the depth of understanding that he has himself achieved at this point. 5. The most powerful support for this interpretation in the text itself is Kant's repeated assertion, perhaps on finding himself driven further by the truth than his system would ideally have liked, that reason necessarily finds itself entangled in such contradictions. There is a subsequent passage, one crucial to his entire practical philosophy, that is, the entire critique of practical reason, in which this process of being impelled towards infinity, into the sphere of the intelligible, is actually equated with the realm of the practical. 6. Kant came very close there to an understanding of the problem that I am talking about today, but failed to draw out its full logical implications, because of what we might call his architectonic need to keep the two spheres of pure reason and practical reason neatly segregated in different compartments. Instead of reflecting on this contradiction and using it as his starting point, he left it in place, and accepted the existence of two different spheres that were independent of each other in principle. Thus we have two approaches, one in which contradictions are distributed, as it were, in a compartmentalizing spirit, in which they are assigned to two different spheres, and one which confronts the contradictions squarely, and attempts through this confrontation to penetrate to the heart of the matter. The difference between them is precisely the contradiction between traditional thinking, or what Hegel calls reflexive thinking, Reflexionsdenken, and dialectical thinking. And when you have succeeded in familiarizing yourselves with the problem that I have been outlining, you will have no difficulty in grasping this. So Kant is concerned to confront the strict meaning of a concept, or perhaps I should rather say, the demand that is implicit in the concept of causality itself, with its consequence, and if a necessary conflict arises, then we find ourselves involved in a dialectical process. At this juncture Kant says the dialectic arises from an error. 7. Hegel would say, on the other hand, if this dialectic, this conflict, turns out to be inevitable in the sense implied in Kant's argument, then we are not confronted by an error, but by a contradiction in which necessity is itself entailed. 8. And this means that in reality as well as in the progress of our thinking, contradictions acquire a dignity of a completely different order from what they have in Kant, who remarks in a harmless and naive way, wholly in the spirit of traditional logic, where there is a contradiction, there must be a mistake. 9. Just as if we had a firm guarantee, as if there were no room for doubt that the world is organized a priori in such a way as to be as free of contradictions as the extensional logic that we have simply superimposed on our chaotic and difficult world in order to bring some sort of scientific order into it. Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to draw your attention to a further important point. Kant was also poised on the threshold of another problem, one that might be called the problem of the prima philosophia, or better, the problem of the very first thing, for as we have seen, he shows both that the assumption of an absolutely first cause leads to contradictions, and conversely, that the problem cannot be resolved by the refusal to make any such assumption, and in so doing, he shows that the concept of any such primal cause itself leads to very great difficulties. On the other hand, however, Kant was a Cartesian in that, like Descartes, he searched for a residue of absolute certainty and at the same time, for a second, free element 10 that one could hold on to firmly and from which everything else followed. and he did this in preference to drawing the conclusion that is really implicit in the doctrine of the antinomies, namely that the search for any such primal cause might itself be a fallacy. 11. You see here once again the peculiar Janus face of Kantian philosophy, and you see it moreover at the very source of his practical philosophy. You can see, on the one hand, how he is driven by his own analysis to the realization that giving any such absolute status to the primal thing, whether it be the category of causality or that of the freedom that necessarily precedes it, leads inexorably to contradictions that prove to be insoluble. On the other hand, he nevertheless refuses to relinquish the idea of something absolute and primary. 12. This leads him, and this is why this issue is so important for practical philosophy, by a coup de main to establish freedom as a law sui generis that then stands absolutely at the beginning, conferring a sort of primacy on practical reason. For you shall learn soon enough that within the Kantian system, there lies hidden a dominant factor that later on comes to the surface in Fichte, in a rather crass fashion. This is the idea that practical reason, that is, action, is accorded an absolute priority over theoretical knowledge. Kant finds himself, therefore, like Hegel, incidentally, in a precarious situation. On the one hand, thanks to the extraordinary vigor with which he pursues his philosophy of origins, he comes up against the outer limits of that philosophy, that is to say, the fact that the concept of the prime mover is antinomic, while, on the other hand, he clings to the idea while refusing to follow through the logic of that antinomy. Those of you who will move on to the study of Hegel will discover that this contradiction remains intact in Hegel. It is not resolved there either, but is simply taken over as it stands. For all his dialectic, Hegel too, just like Kant, accepts something like the dominance of an absolute prime mover, only in his case it is the infinite subject, absolute spirit. 13. We might perhaps consider the issue in more general terms, by saying that there is a first thing as an aspect of the immediate, but really only as an aspect. For what has been caused, what has become, is always mediated precisely through its having become something, and the causa itself is likewise mediated, since the causa can only be the cause in so far as it is the cause of its effect, and not a cause in general but this element or a moment of immediacy. This first cause of something given cannot be an immediate given in an absolute and positive sense. This dialectical consequence is one that can likewise be inferred from the Kantian doctrine of the antinomies. Even if we set aside these considerations that I have attempted to distill from the doctrine of the antinomies, there remains a great mass of difficulties. These difficulties pertain in the first instance to the relations between the concepts of causality, law and freedom that Kant introduces. I believe that most of you will have registered the difficulties that I have in mind quite simply and straightforwardly by noting Kant's curious linguistic usage, in particular when he talks of a special causality, a causality born of freedom, Kausalität aus Freiheit, for according to the ideas that we commonly associate with these concepts, causality means the strict and regular determinacy by causes. It is the very antithesis of what we normally understand by freedom. In fact, the pivotal issue here, and for any concept of moral philosophy, not just Kant's, is how to bring these concepts of law and freedom together. The point to make first, lest you imagine that Kant's curious treatment of these concepts of freedom, law and causation involves a complete surrender to arbitrary whim and caprice, is that in Kant the concept of causality is extraordinarily broad. In the light of developments in the problem of determinism in modern science, I think it is very important to reflect on this. In the scientific discourse where Kant has formed a starting point, for example, in the debates about Einstein's relativity theory, and even more strongly in the debate about quantum mechanics, the Kantian concept of causality, Kant's doctrine of causality, has consistently been interpreted in too narrow a sense. In Kant himself the concept of causality is in fact extremely broad, that is to say, his definition is highly formal, and for my part, I believe that in the famous debate about relativity theory Ernst Cassirer was not altogether in the wrong when he maintained that thanks to its formal nature Kantian philosophy would be in a position to encompass relativity theory. 14. You will perhaps recall the formula that I read out to you earlier, that everything which takes place presupposes a preceding state upon which it inevitably follows according to a rule. 15. This phrase inevitably follows according to a rule can only mean that a universal law tells us that if a particular state has the form A, it must be followed by a state with the form B. Kant would be the first to add, and with this we are on strictly Kantian terrain, that if that turns out not to work, if something else follows, then we need to search for a further, higher rule that explains why this was not the case. What strikes us first about this concept of causality, and I am appealing here to your everyday consciousness, one uncontaminated by philosophy, is a particular kind of externality. By speaking of externality, I intend no critical or polemical view of Kant, but am referring to a feature of the critique of pure reason that is very pronounced, and that has to be understood if we are to understand Kantian philosophy. In general, Kant was critical of rationalism of the kind espoused by Leibniz and Wolff, because he vigorously opposed the principle of an inner causation, that is, a causation of things or objects in themselves, independently of the subject that confers on them the laws of causality. He launched an extremely sharp critique of the idea that we can know the internal nature of objects, and hence their inner determinations, in a very important note to the chapter entitled The Amphiboly of Concepts of Reflection. 16. Perhaps you will recollect for a moment that, apart from the dynamic categories, one of the general theses of Kantian philosophy that is known to all of you is that things in themselves are obscure and unknowable by us. We are only able to construct these objects by virtue of our apparatus of categories, and the evidence of our senses. In other words, we only construct objects, as it were, from outside and with the assistance of our own consciousness. We cannot enter into them. If you recall this, it will be obvious to you that Kant must likewise reject the idea that we can observe the process of causation, or dynamic interaction of objects in themselves. It would probably even be enough to remind ourselves that Kant defined the object as something constructed by us in order to exclude the possibility that we could take these objects that are our own products, and of whose inner nature we know nothing, and go on and ascribe to them an internal existence of the kind conjectured by the preceding rationalist philosophy. But this very exteriority itself has something unsatisfactory about it, because the entirely formal framework of rules is capable of subsuming all sorts of things in itself that may well be wholly incompatible with anything that we might conceive of under the title of causality. It is by no means a bad rule in philosophy that it is inadvisable to give the concepts that you use meanings that are merely derived from your own philosophical system, and that are completely different from those in use in everyday speech, and which the reader has in a sense a right to expect. So in the spirit of such a set of rules, if we ignore the chronological sequence of cause and effect, the statistical regularity found in quantum mechanics today would come within the scope of Kantian causality, just as well as anything else. 17. But of course it would do so at the cost of what we all understand by causality. The answer to this on the part of the progressive sciences is simply that our minds have not advanced beyond the level of mythology, that in our everyday consciousness we are lagging behind the stage reached by scientific criticism, and that we are still operating with a basically animistic conception, according to which things have an inner soul and an inward determinacy. Conceptions which have ceased to be tenable now that the concepts of knowledge have been filtered, as they have in philosophical criticism. This so-called external nature of causality, which incidentally is something that the whole of later scientific thought, and the whole of positivism shares with Kant, and which, as in Hume, has been taken incomparably further than it was by Kant himself, arises from the fact that causality does not reside in things in themselves. It is, rather, an ordering principle according to which the subject combines successive states with each other. 18. This means then that causality has nothing to do with the explanation of motivation, which sets out a further understanding of successive events from within. It aims to achieve this on the basis of our inward awareness, in which subject and object, that is, our experience of ourselves and we ourselves as the thing we experience, coincide, or are supposed to coincide, so that the problem of the opposition between inner and outer disappears. In consequence of this, and this is a motif that was brought up in criticism of Kant, particularly by Schopenhauer. 19. It was claimed that there was a special form of causality that Kant had really ignored, namely a causality from within, and this was in fact what motivation was. 20. However, in Kant, and this is why I have made so much of the remarkable breadth of the term causality, the concept of causality, that is, this sequence of states in accordance with rules, is broad enough to leave room for something we can call motivation. This remains true even without taking any such coincidence of inner and outer into account. That is to say, there is space for subjective certainty, or immediate certainty, to explain why two states should follow on from one another. Why this should be the case is not a matter that Kant reflects on, but he does draw certain inferences from it nevertheless. For example, he says that causality has a number of possibilities. We might put it in scientific terms, and say that there is a special case of causality, in which the kind of externality of which I have told you does not exist, but that instead there is a kind of causality, in which we can instigate a series of events linked by cause and effect, from within our own consciousness. What Kant has in mind here, he does not say so explicitly, but there is no doubt about what he meant, is simply the basic fact of some decision or other. 21. I may remind you of the hapless book that from time to time I have dropped on the table, and by means of which I intervene on my own initiative, beginning a new causal series into which a kind of caesura is inserted at this juncture. I am trying to express myself very cautiously here. 22. For in this very difficult grey area, Kant himself expressed himself anything but clearly, and for the very good reason that it is very hard to be clear about it. So Kant obviously assumed that within the framework of this universal causality, there is something like a point at which the subject may intervene, and from which it may set the primary conditions for an entire causal series. He believed, further, that within this realm of practice, of practical action, the point at which this new causal series begins could be specified. For this reason he thought that we can speak of something like an exceptional situation in the realm of practice, that is to say, in the motivated behavior of human beings. Now Kant was an extraordinarily honest man, and just as sharp in his thinking as he was honest, and he by no means overlooked the question that is on the tip of your tongues at this point. This concerns the fact that an action initiated in freedom, in which I independently intervene in something, thereby enters for its part into a new causal chain. So if I may come back once again to this idiotic example of dropping a book, this is in the first instance my own free decision, but it may at the same time be regarded as the product of a whole series of other events. For example, I find myself under the necessity of demonstrating to you this phenomenon of a so-called free act, and have nothing else to hand but this accursed book. So I drop it, and this can in its turn be referred back to all sorts of other things such as the internalization of the concept of duty, and God knows what else. So what I want to say is that major factors and trivial ones are all tied into each other in the strangest way. Kant would not deny any of this, and there is a passage, we shall look at it closely, in which Kant readily concedes that so-called free actions are themselves subject to universal determination. 23. But Kant's way of dealing with this question, and indeed with a number of other analogous questions elsewhere in his philosophy, is to proceed phenomenologically, to use a term that came into being very much later. What that means is that he is not concerned to make a final, definitive statement about the nature of such an action in this respect. 2. We might say that he would cultivate a certain externality, but instead what concerns him is that at this particular moment I have this particular experience. I can drop the object now, that is an immediately given reality, and it is quite different from my turning a tap on, and as long as it is on the water pours out. No matter how we may think of these two events within the total or universal network of causality, there is a real distinction at the level of personal experience. So there is in Kant. I have already said this, and perhaps you can see here why it is so important for an understanding of his philosophy, something over and above the systematic impulse, the desire to construct as coherent an overall totality out of discrete units as is possible. There is in addition, and you come across it in all sorts of places, this respect for given realities, for everything that cannot be inferred from something else. In fact, in his practical philosophy he treats freedom, or rather its supreme principle, the moral law, which demands nothing other than that I act purely in accordance with reason as such a given. He treats it as something that in a sense cannot be inferred from anything else, simply because it is identical with the very same principle of reason, which alone would be capable of drawing such an inference. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why I attach such great importance to explaining these rather complicated matters to you here is that they really are important, if we are to lay the foundation for a moral philosophy. This is because my affirmation of the principle of freedom would achieve precious little in practice, if we simply persisted with the assertion that in an absolute sense something like freedom exists. But as soon as I enter the limited realm of experience, the finite sphere of experience, I find it under the domination of causality, and there is no freedom in sight, for practice is always the practice of empirical human beings, and it pertains to things given in empirical reality. Here, too, Kant finds himself caught up in a certain contradiction. On the one hand, he has strictly to maintain the distinction between the intelligible and the empiric L, for the fact is that if he were to tie the intelligible or absolute to empirical conditions, it would be at the cost of its absolute character and its absolute authority. But on the other hand, if these two spheres are absolutely separate and have nothing in common with each other, and indeed this seems to be what Kant is saying elsewhere, then it would be quite impossible to speak of any morality and any such distinctions between right and wrong behavior. This is because everything that pertains to real action would simply become part of the empirical chain of cause and effect. For this reason Kant has to conduct a desperate search for something like a realm in which the two coexist, I won't say simultaneously, but a realm in which I am justified in speaking of the given nature of what would be inconceivable simply as a given within our experience, because it is something infinite, something that transcends the boundaries of possible experience. What we are referring to here is simply that possibility of initiating a causal series in some sense or other. I am telling you this, and shall then explicate it in connection with the relevant chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason, because in the fully developed practical philosophy of Kant this has the very great consequence that it results in a very curious theory that we shall have to look at more closely. This is the idea that while it is true that all my actions are conditioned by my character, from which they necessarily flow, this character is one that I give myself through a free act. 24. The only possible meaning that can be given to this free act is what I am tempted to call the purely epistemological one, that as human beings we are able to initiate causal series, which are not automatically included in the universal network of causality. In the light of our empirical knowledge today about the considerable importance of early childhood experiences for the conditioning and formation of our character, it is evident that the theory that I am supposed to have conferred my character on myself will encounter the very greatest difficulties, but that is not something we can consider here. What I wanted to show you here is, firstly, why Kant arrives at this construct of a causality born of freedom, and, secondly, how he gets into difficulty as a consequence and sets about seeking a solution. Let me close by reminding you briefly why he insists on a causality born of freedom. We could start by saying, well then, he wants causality because on the basis of the doctrine of categories, causality is a universal law to which absolutely everything is subject and which tolerates no exceptions. And he wants freedom because without freedom there would not really be anything like reason and humanity. But this account is too superficial what lies behind it, and this is hinted at in a passage in the doctrine of the antinomies that I shall perhaps discuss briefly in the next lecture, is the idea that behavior that is quite devoid of causality and is therefore absolutely free, in other words, behavior without any rules at all, would be simply chaotic. In that event an amorphous and formed nature would in fact triumph over the principle of reason, to which Kant quite unambiguously confides the task of resisting that same chaotic disorder of nature in a number of passages in the Critique of Judgment. On the other hand, if the law is universal, then this puts an end to the possibility of anything higher than nature. That means in its turn that human beings are nothing but a piece of this blind nature, and are unable to escape from it. Therefore, Reason requires something like a universal conformity to law, because only if there is such a conformity to law can reason resist this blind, amorphous force. By the same token, it requires freedom, because in the face of the amorphousness of nature, freedom is the only possible countervailing force. This twofold difficulty, the fact that the sphere of the human can exist neither in absolute conformity to law, nor in absolute freedom, is the true and profound reason why Kant finds himself forced into this paradoxical construct of a causality born of freedom. 25. Thank you. Lecture 6. The 30th of May, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, I must start with an announcement. I shall have to cancel the lecture in 2 weeks' time because I am taking part in the Europa Symposium in Vienna. There will be no lecture the following Thursday anyway because of the holiday on Corpus Christi, so we shall next meet in 3 weeks' time. I should like to begin by summarizing some of the things I may have said a little too hurriedly at the end of the last lecture, and shall then use the rest of the lecture to take a relatively close look at Kant's text, in order to say a few things about the relation between theoretical and practical philosophy in Kant. The first point, then, is that I should remind you that the difficulties we have been experiencing with Kant's doctrine of the antinomies can be traced back to the fact that Kant's philosophy has a dual character. On the one hand, there is a critical strand of thought, that is, the dissolution of dogmatic ideas that had simply been handed down, and that he overcomes by recourse to a constitutive subjectivity. At the same time, he sets limits by establishing that the knowledge the naive consciousness tends to think of as the knowledge of things is in reality knowledge that arises merely in the subjective mind and cannot therefore be said to be the direct knowledge of existence. On the other hand, opposed to this and at least as powerful, there is the other strand of thought according to which he would like to try to salvage the objective character of thought through this subjective analysis. Moreover, he aims to go even further than this since he strives to rescue what before him was known as ontology, and what we are again inclined to call ontology today, and he hopes to rescue it in a particular sphere, namely the sphere of the intelligible, and this means for him the sphere of morality or freedom. This dual character is what actually motivates the strange attitude that Kant adopts towards the problem of freedom. If we assert that the doctrine of causality and freedom in the Critique of Pure Reason has been presented in an antinomic manner, we do not entirely do justice to the situation, since the final result of the analysis of the third antinomy does not take the form, it can be like this or it can be like that. Instead, given the general thrust of the analysis in the Critique of Pure Reason, the situation is rather that the discussion of freedom and conditioning is broken off. It is as if Kant were asserting that for me to put the question in those terms is itself to make an error that prevents further progress. The implication is that if I am debarred from putting the question, I shall remain trapped in the empirical realm in which causality rules, and that the only claim I may not make on behalf of this causality is that it is absolutely valid in the realm of empirical objects. Notwithstanding this, in the Critique of Pure Reason, at least in the doctrine of the antinomies, the crucial decision was really made in favor of causality, in the spirit of the theoretical use of reason only with the caveats we have already discussed. 2. In contrast to that, the other side, what we can call the ontological side, or perhaps the preserving, salvaging side of Kant, or indeed the side that opposes the universal skepticism of a consistent nominalism, is expressed in a teaching that does not actually occur in the doctrine of the antinomies in this form. This is the doctrine that the moral sphere is in principle separate from that of knowledge and, positively, that it is the sphere of freedom, or as Kant himself phrases it in a very prominent passage, in the realm of morality freedom is a fact of experience. Point 3. I tried to show you last time what meaning can be given to this strange thesis about the experience of freedom, when we set out to examine aspects of the concept of motivation and the dual character of law. But at any rate, we can summarize once more the meaning of the doctrine of the third antinomy, the antinomy of causality and freedom. If causality rules absolutely, if, in other words, there is nothing but the law of cause and effect, this would make an absolute of the laws imposed by human beings on the things in themselves of which they actually know nothing, that is, of everything that is needed to control nature, both human and extra-human. This would confer on that absolute the same quality of blindness and externality which, as I explained to you last time, is characteristic of causality in nature and knowledge in terms of the categories as developed in the spirit of Kant. The domination of nature, and we might well say, as blind domination it means mere nature, would itself become an absolute. For if, on the other hand, there were nothing but freedom, or as Kant puts it, freedom without guidance, without a law that could organize the phenomenal world, it would be a form of freedom that is quite devoid of any element of law, and hence it too would signify a relapse into a mere state of nature, namely into the natural chaos of a purely arbitrary state of affairs. It is interesting to note that on the one hand, in his critique of the consequences that the doctrine of absolute freedom would have, Kant uses the same expression blind, that he also used when he was speaking of the exclusive dominance of causality. 5. His philosophy as a whole is opposed to both. It is opposed to the making absolute of the mechanical principle, and the critique of this making absolute of the mechanical principle forms the essential content of the critique of judgment, and it is no less opposed, on the other hand, to the amorphous, accidental and arbitrary. For his part, Kant never deviates for a single second from his conviction that the unity to be discovered in our reason must also be ascribed to things in themselves. If those things are to be otherwise than truly chaotic, a relapse into utter blindness and disorder. I do not wish to discuss here the idea that the unity imposed on the world by the organization of the rational logos must necessarily also constitute a determination of the world itself, but it does appear to me that at this point, there is a